Okay, guys, let's talk about quotations today. The first part of this lecture, I'm going to talk about sort of the logistics or how to format quotes, and then the second part of the lecture, I'll talk about how to incorporate quotes effectively into a paper. So I want to talk first about what quotes are. When I say direct quotes, what I'm referring to is something that's taken word for word from a text or an article. And anytime you use a direct quote, you have to use quotation marks and then an in-text citation. Remember, in-text citations are the ones that come in parentheses. They're also called parenthetical citations, and the in-text citation comes right after the quote when you're using it with a quotation. What you quote is up to you. You might quote a single word, you might quote a phrase, an entire sentence. But what's really important when you're quoting is to make sure that you quote accurately, meaning that you don't make a typo, you don't misrepresent what the author is saying, and making sure that you show where the quotation begins and where it ends. A lot of times students start a quote with quotation marks and then forget to put on the end quote. So you want to make sure that you show where the quote begins and where it ends. So now I want to talk about some different punctuation marks and other pieces of information that you'll need for formatting quotes correctly. So the first thing I want to talk about is called the ellipsis. You've seen this before. If you look at the screen, the arrow where I'm circling those three dots, that dot, 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 that's an ellipsis. And when you see an ellipsis within a quotation, what that means is that you've omitted part of the quote. So it shows your reader that something was here, but you didn't need it for your quote, and so you took it out. You only want to include in a quote what's necessary to support what you're saying, and so sometimes you might want like the beginning of something and the end and not the middle, and that's when you would use an ellipsis. So in my example, which is from a piece by Dr. Martin Luther King called Letter from a Birmingham Jail, you see the original quote, which is, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And then you see my citation with the last name and the page number. So in the second sample, I've decided that I only want part of the quote, and so I've used the ellipsis to show my reader that I've omitted through painful experience that, so that you can see how the ellipsis functions there. Continuing to the ellipsis, you want to make sure you don't use the ellipsis to misrepresent what's being said. So I give you an example of that below. In the first example, I give you the full quote. And in the second example, I've omitted part of the quote, but I've used the ellipsis to manipulate what King is saying. And I've actually defined a just law incorrectly according to King. So you want to make sure that when you're using an ellipsis, you use it fairly, and you don't use it to misrepresent what an author is saying. The next thing I want to talk about is what we refer to as long quotes. And for the sake of writing, that's going to be any quote that's 4 lines or more. And you format these quotes differently than you do a normal quote. So the way that you format a long quote with MLA, with Modern Language Association, is that you set off the quote with indentations instead of quotation marks. So you would indent the entire quote 10 spaces or 2 tabs, and you would keep your double spacing just like you use throughout the rest of your essay. And you would not use quotation marks around a long quote. The indentations show that it's a quote. Now, speaking of long quotes, you want to use long quotes sparingly. Quotes are used to enhance what you're saying, but your paper should not just be long quote after long quote. I like to use an eating metaphor here. If you think about cooking, when you use salt, you use that to enhance the flavor of what you're cooking. And that is what you should think of when you're using quotes. Use quotes like salt. Use them a little bit sprinkled throughout your paper to help enhance what you're saying. If you use too many quotes or too much salt, for my metaphor, your dish is not going to taste good or your essay is not going to be effective. The next piece of punctuation that you want to be aware of is what's called square brackets. And you can see what I mean by that in the example. The words civil disobedience are within the square brackets. And you use square brackets inside a quote to add information that your reader might need to know in order to understand the quote. So if I were using this quote below, the original quote is, "It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions." But if I were to use this quote in an essay, my reader wouldn't know what it referred to without the context. So what I've done is I've added civil disobedience to clarify what it means. So anytime you see information in square brackets within a quote, that means the author has added that information in order to clarify the quote. And you can do that too in your writing. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about is this word sic, S-I-C. You've maybe seen this before when you're reading. It's Latin and it translates to "thus the air was." And what it means is that there's an error in the original quote and you are aware of it as the writer, but you can't change a quote. So even if there's a spelling error or some other kind of error in a quote, you can't change it because you're not allowed to change quoted information. But what you can do is you can add that word "sic" in square brackets in order to tell your reader that you weren't the one who made the error. So let's look at the example that I've given. When Hitler invaded Poland, people didn't know, sic, whether they should fight or surrender. So I'm pretending that this is the original quote and that there was a spelling error of N-O rather than K-N-O-W. And I've put in "sic" to let the reader know that I'm aware of that spelling error that existed in the original quote. Okay, so I'm going to end here, and then I'm going to start another lecture where we'll talk about how to choose quotes and how to incorporate them effectively.